one patron question comes from Christopher. He says, Ben, I noticed that often you make overarching statements about self-proclaimed anarchists on Twitter. I would like to know what your opinion is on historical anarchism and how it has been used as a countervailing force against fascism and corporate totalitarianism, and if you see any use for the principles of anarchism, i.e. mutual aid, horizontal organizing, etc.
Absolutely. There are some good things that anarchism absolutely has to offer, as with anything on the left. Even social democracy has some good things to offer. The issue when I'm criticizing anarchists is I've been using the term anarcho-neocon more, and people laugh when they say what that is, but to try to be more specific, so because I have, this sounds like one of those stupid, like, I have friends who are black or whatever. Like, I have friends and comrades who are anarchists who I respect, even though we disagree in some issues. The issue is that there's a fundamental line. We can disagree in some issues of tactics and things, but there is a significant chunk of anarchists and what you could say ultra-leftists. I get that's ultra-left is usually used as a criticism. You could say left communists. They're libertarian socialists, the term people use. There is a significant chunk, I'm not going to say all at all, it's certainly not all, definitely not all, but there's a significant chunk of these people who objectively side with imperialism. So when it comes to the coup in Venezuela, they say Maduro is an authoritarian dictator and we support the left opposition against Maduro. Look, I've spent a lot of time in Venezuela. There is no significant left opposition. I'm sorry, that's just the reality. And you might know some person on Twitter who, by the way, is tweeting in English for some reason or writing articles in English in a country where only the bourgeoisie speaks English, only like the elite speak English. Certainly working class labor organizers working in co-ops don't speak English. And there are co-ops. And look, some of the people in the cooperatives in Venezuela might have some critiques of the government, but they're hardcore Chavistas who support the government through and through at the end of the day. And they understand that this idea of like there's some kind of left opposition against the Chavistas or the Sandinistas here in Nicaragua, they don't exist. I'm sorry. There are a very tiny little slew of people who are writing in English for an English language audience, who are from the bourgeoisie and often don't even live in Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba. They live in Europe or the US, and they're part of this. I mean, look, here's an example of this. In Venezuela, the so-called left opposition has a voice called Aporrea. Aporrea was founded by Chavistas who later became disenchanted and they moved to the left, many Trotskyites, some anarchists. One of the main leaders of that movement last year in February, when Juan Guaido, this US puppet, declared himself fake president, one of the main leaders of the fake left opposition met with Juan Guaido. And actually two leaders of the so-called left opposition who have no they have no power in Venezuela whatsoever. They certainly don't have power in co-ops or the organized working class. So that is a non-insignificant number of anarchists and libertarian socialists, and people really need to understand that. Now, there also are more libertarian-leaning Chavistas who work in co-ops. That's great. I've seen them with my own eyes. It's great. I've been to some of the co-ops, San Agustin, others. There's a great co-op called Maisal, which is a great co-op. And like I said, they might have some criticism of the government because they're kind of more anarchist-leaning, but they're still a hardcore Chavistas who, at the end of the day, support the elected government of Maduro. And more importantly, because Maduro is not in charge of everything. This idea that he's a dictator, it's so people don't understand how states work. In fact, Maduro is probably not the most powerful person in Venezuela. I'll just say that. There are some powerful people in the government who have just as much, if not more power as Maduro. And then there's the issue of Syria, and it's the same kind of thing. Look, I get why people might have critiques of these states who certainly sometimes have authoritarian measures, but we also have to understand, not necessarily excusing them, we have to understand why they exist. Why? First of all, Cuba is a good example of this. Cuba has internal elections, and that's almost never discussed on the U.S. left, including especially by people who criticize Cuba and call it a so-called dictatorship. Okay, Cuba doesn't have presidential elections, but the U.S. doesn't really have presidential elections either. I mean, and not that anarchists are defending U.S. presidential elections and the farce of so-called U.S. bourgeois democracy, but also like there's this fetishization of elections as some kind of democratic measure. I would argue that Cuba is actually much more democratic by any small d anarchist definition of the term. In terms of the power that working class people have in society, they have much more power in Cuba than they have not only in Western capitalist countries, but including in social democratic countries in Scandinavia. So the point is that there's this kind of absolutist view that sees any kind of institutional, including especially state power, as inherently bad, but it doesn't take into account imperialism and sabotage. If Cuba just got rid of some of these so-called more authoritarian measures, it would be overthrown. The U.S. government, and it's not a cop-out, this is 100% the reality. The person who has had more assassination attempts against him in U.S. history, in world history, is Fidel Castro, who had, we know of, at least 638 assassination attempts by U.S. intelligence agencies. Just the U.S., it's not counting other countries. So, and there were so many terror attacks by U.S.-backed terrorists like Posada Carriles. There was acts of sabotage, economic sabotage. There was an economic blockade which still exists. This is also true, by the way, of the Eastern European countries that had socialist governments, including Yugoslavia, which was slightly more libertarian leaning, if you will, and the Soviet Union. And we have to be able to acknowledge the many accomplishments that the Soviet Union had while acknowledging the weaknesses and the shortcomings rather. And we also have to acknowledge the degree to which, look, sure, you could say the DDR, East Germany had all these bad things, whatever. But we also have to be able to acknowledge it in the context of what I was talking about earlier, a literal terrorist war funded by the CIA and the capitalist West German government, literally arming former Nazis who had fought in the SS and supported Adolf Hitler. And then what happens after World War II? 70% of the West German government, of the Justice Department, is former Nazis, and they have Nazi death squads trying to overthrow violently, using acts of terror, the East German socialist government and poison school children's milk. That a lot of look, I've talked about this before. I used to be an anarchist, and I'm not trying to be like condescending. It was when I was in college. It was like in high school. I was in high school during Occupy, and then college, and I was into anarchism. That was kind of like in vogue in the U.S. left. I was politicized by Chomsky and Howard Zinn and these more anarchisty thinkers. But over time, I'm not trying to condescend, just frankly educating myself more and learning this history, you realize how hard it is to actually have a functioning socialist government, socialist society. And look, I'll just be real here. The only socialist societies that have existed in modern history, if we're not fetishizing in some ways the horrors of feudal society and pre-feudal society where people died when they were 30 or 40 years old. Sure, they had no state, but they didn't have much of a society either. Look, we can look at the Spanish Revolution, and sure, there are some good things to celebrate, but also it was defeated by fascism. It lasted for a few years. They lost. They failed. And unfortunately, there are so many other examples of these anarchist examples failing, because the reality is that anarchists, once they overthrow the state or whatever, or have a revolution, they very quickly realize, it dawns on them, if you don't have a state, if you don't have a standing army, which is not volunteer, which is a mandatory army, then you're not going to be able to defend that state very quickly, because you're going to be invaded by imperialist capitalist countries overnight or very quickly. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to either have state mechanisms to defend those socialist gains, as would happen in the Soviet Union. They were invaded by 22 imperialist countries, and there was a massive war in which the genocidal anti-Semitic czarist white army, which included many proto-fascist elements, was fighting against the Reds. And a huge section of the anarchists joined the Bolsheviks because they realized that if they wanted to defend the socialist gains as workers that they had, they did actually have to have some state mechanisms, because the choice was the destruction of their anarchist society and the victory of fascism, or the acknowledgement that you have to have some kind of state measures. That's the short answer.